Hello, 4 years ago I made a video called Updating Designs where it took Samus's helmet here and pretty much showed you how you can take a video game model and just kind of update the design. So I'm going to do something similar with the Let's Model Zero Mission, Metroid Zero Mission series. So I'm using a different model here. Last time I used the armor design from Metroid Other M. This time I used the armor design from Metroid Prime 2 Echoes. This one is from the Wii and this is from the GameCube. So you can pretty much see how I took the original mesh and just kind of made my own design on top of it. Detached parts, remodeled parts, pretty much using the original game asset as a starting base. One of my hobbies is taking old video game models and kind of remastering them, or at least putting my own spin on it, which is what I'm going to do here. I'll start with the helmet. This is also kind of a way to see how much I've changed in the past 4 years, because this first series was done in February of 2016. So it's been over 4 years now. So am I a worse artist? Am I a better artist? How has my design aesthetic since changed? All these questions and more may or may not be answered in this video of Let's Model Metroid Zero Mission. Alright, so let's get started. One thing to keep in mind is how older games, especially on the GameCube and PlayStation 2 for example, handle their textures. You can see, for example, if I click on this part is pretty much using, let me just turn this off, Control-Shift-A for disable always on top. So pretty much all this geometry is using the same kind of UV space and the same texture. It's very fascinating to see how they pretty much saved on texture space and UV space. You can see, for example, all of this right here, I just kind of move it here. This is all pretty much using the same texture to save on texture space, just to add these kinds of side panels, the side details. So if we look closer, we can see how it's kind of a simple gradient going from kind of dark orange to yellowish, light orange. And that's pretty much allows all this geometry to pretty much use the same texture space, because they had very limited texture space here. They didn't have, for example, 2048 by 2048 textures. They had like a 64 by 64 size texture. I'll upload a material editor to take a look. So you can see the various textures. We can see this is the size of the texture. As you can see, it's a very tiny texture, and that's being applied on all this geometry. So it's really ingenious how they pretty much had to save and work within the limitations. So this one, the largest texture right here. So that's for the main armor. Then, for example, for the various gun parts, this very tiny texture right here, and just have to kind of reuse it as much as possible. So, for example, this right here, this small texture, is being used for all this geometry right here. You can also see various other shortcuts. For example, Samus's right arm is actually amputated here. You can see when it goes to the gun, it just ends on a spike right here. So in order to get started with the helmet, what I'm going to do is just to detach this part. So I'm going to go into element level and detach it. I may have to just go into vertex level, just weld everything first. So maybe just Control A and weld just 0.001, and now I should be able to select the entire element here. Alright, and this right here as well. I want to move a little bit first just to make sure I have all the correct parts selected. Alright, move that off to the side. Next we've got the visor. You can see there's even a head in here as well. So sometimes there's duplicated faces. we can see here, for example, looks like we have duplicate faces, so I may just want to select all those polygons. Alright, so I've got a few little pieces here sticking out, so I'm going to get those as well. Alright, there we go. So now I'm pretty much going to just hide this, but maybe we can get a little bit of this as well here. And pretty much just going to serve as a nice base. Of course, a lot of times you don't start from scratch, but sometimes it's just very convenient. If a model already exists, you may as well use it to get started. And actually for this situation, I think we should be able just to extract just a single element here. You can see how it's pretty much the same geometry, same texture. They're just different versions of this. Alright, now I'm going to hide this. And pretty much what I would do is just select all the parts I want to work with. And then Control I to select inverse and hide this. Or I can just kind of, if I want to be more careful, I can just hide parts one by one just to make sure I'm not accidentally hiding the wrong thing. There we go. So now I've got all the parts I want to work with, so I can select them all and just enter in 0 right here to move them all back to 0. Alright, and I can, for example, leave this with a purple object color just so I can differentiate between what I've done here and the original geometry. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and start with this, for example. What I would do is just kind of clone this. And so what I can do is go into freeform, or actually go into modeling first, and then geometry, quadrify all. I want to make sure, sometimes when you use quadrify all, it can distort some of the texture a little bit. So I want to make sure nothing has been too distorted. Alright, now I can, for example, subdivide this. I'm just going to insert a loop here just to make this a little bit sharper. Alright. I want to check that. As you can see, subdivision here is not a good idea because it kind of distorts the texture too much. Let's try using Open Subdiv and see if we can change some of the options here. Because under Open Subdiv, we have some various UV boundary options here, such as bilinear, smooth. It looks like the bilinear option kind of minimizes the texture distortion, but it's still too much. So in this situation, I'm just going to not have any subdivision going on, which means I can get rid of this loop. Alright, so what I'm going to do is, if you go into freeform, under polydraw you have this option called New Object. So normally what I did was I had to detach a polygon here and start with that as a base, but if you want, you can just have that New Object option and then just start on this. Click on Surface, I'll pick this as a surface, and what I'm going to do is to begin building some basic geometry around top of the surface here. Alright, and so I think this part is jutting out here a little bit. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to switch object color real quick here. At this point I want to use a very basic material. Now eventually I'm going to apply material that's more reflective and looks more like metal, but in the beginning stages you don't want your material to be too reflective because that would make it easier, that would make it more difficult to see the shapes. When you're first modeling, you want to focus on just the shapes and you don't want the reflections or the shadows to kind of interfere with that. It's going to provide too much information and make it more difficult to read the shapes. So as you're modeling here, throughout the entire process, you can actually change your materials to reflect the current stage of your modeling process and designing process. So you go for more basic colors and materials that allow you to read your shape better, and later on transition to more realistic materials that you are going to render. What I can also do is just select these vertices and apply a push modifier just to push it all out like this. Alright, now we've got kind of this shape. And so now at this point I can begin to create more detailed parts. So for example, what I would do here is just select these edges and just kind of extrude this out and then just attach this. And now we've got this object here, and if you look at the texture, you can see how this looks to be some sort of tubing or some sort of muscle fiber texture here. So I can just use, for example, cut, and then for example I can extrude. Go into the border level, just like the border, and just extrude all this down here. And so you can see how we've got a more detailed object really quickly. And then right away you can start to add further detail just by, for example, selecting some polygons here and then beveling, scaling, moving, and insetting. But we don't want to get too focused on any kind of intricate shapes here. I just want to show you how you can very quickly begin to remodel and go from a very basic object with a very basic texture to now multiple objects that you can add a huge amount of detail to. So you can see how when I look at the topology here, I already start to see ideas for designs. One thing you can do as a designer is just use the topology as a nice little starting point. So just look at the topology here, and you can create a nice shape just from this. And then, for example, you can extrude this. And you've got that. Apply new poly modifier. And for example, you can inset here. Alright, I'm going to clean this up a little bit, which I'm going to do using cut. So got this, and I can just gonna clean this up a little bit as well. So now I can bevel this and then detach this as a clone. Just change the object color here. Insert some loops. And then I can shell this. straighten corners on. You can see it's a little bit rough here. It's not perfectly lined up, but this is a very good starting point for these kinds of details. You can see how we're starting to just get carried away with details here. So one of my biggest mistakes as a designer, which I still make to this day, is I get too carried away with these small details and I miss the big picture. These kinds of small details, you should only be adding them at the very end. And you can see here, I'm already starting to work on these small details. So you gotta catch yourself doing those kind of things. You gotta take a step back and realize, okay, it's way too early to be doing that. However, at the same time, there is a use for these kind of small details, because the small details you create here can inform the rest of your design. In other words, if I do take the time to make some small details, I can then use what I've done here to inform and create the rest of the model. So for example, you can see how I've got these kinds of panel lines and I've got these kinds of nice extrusions. I can use the shapes and design of this small area and incorporate them into the rest of the helmet to give the design a sense of unity. And that way, the designs around your helmet will have kind of a similar motif to them. So as I create this part of the helmet and this part, I can do a similar procedure and get similar results, which will make the helmet look like it was just manufactured by a single entity, a single designer, and not just an artist randomly adding details here and here and here. So maybe it is actually worth it to spend a little bit of time on these small details. And just to see what I can do here real quick. So you can see you get some really nice, slick little details here. And sometimes you get details by accident. You can see here I used regularizer, but it didn't quite work because sometimes when you use regularizer you have to use it multiple times until you get a perfect circle. But in this case it gave me this more of an oval shape, which I can use to get more of this kind of oval design right here. So sometimes accidents and mistakes can actually help the design process. One of the things I always encourage people to do is to use the accidents. So I'm going to press F2 to get rid of the red selection effect, because with it kind of blocks my view. I'm just going to move this here, see if I like that, maybe move it forward, positive direction, see if I like that, and just kind of see what I like more. Maybe I want to inset this first and then extrude. Maybe I like this more. So I'm just experimenting with different design motifs, which I can then incorporate in the rest of the helmet. Maybe we can move this a little bit. Maybe I could just select all of this here and just move all of this. So it can be a little bit messy when you just move things in screen space. So for example here I can really just kind of go off the rails here, but if you're a little bit careful you can treat it almost like sculpting in ZBrush, where it's a little bit messy and it does need cleanup, but it can still help you to create some designs really quickly here. So now I've kind of got this. I'm thinking, do I like this? Do I not like this? I can select this, for example, and use set flow to just kind of get rid of this flatness and just kind of smooth things out here. Or I can stress this flatness by simply insetting here. Now I can just turn edit poly on and off and see, what do I like more? Do I like this flatness or do I like it to be smooth in there? And so maybe I can just select all of this and then use regularizer. Get a nice circle here, for example, rotate it. Now I've got this shape. Maybe I like this shape more. You can see how it looks quite messy here, but at render time, at television, it looks better. So now I've got this. So you can see I get all sorts of results just by doing some basic movement here. You don't have to get all too fancy with booleans or anything like that. You can take advantage of the simple nature of polygons to get these kind of subdivided results.